A cocky American tourist spat in the face of an Edinburgh Castle guard, thinking his money could buy him any thrill. But one commanding gesture from the guard and the unexpected appearance of a decorated war hero changed everything. Here's how it happened. A crisp autumn morning wrapped Edinburgh Castle in a mystical Highland mist, the ancient fortress looming above Scotland's capital like a silent guardian of centuries past. Wisps of fog danced between the medieval towers, their stone walls holding 1,000 years of history within their weathered embrace. The castle grounds were beginning to stir as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the morning haze, casting long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard where countless kings and queens had once walked, their footsteps now echoing through time. Tourist season was at its peak, despite the October chill that painted visitors' breath in small clouds of white. Already a steady stream of eager sightseers made their way up the Royal Mile, cameras and phones ready to capture a piece of Scottish heritage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Some clutched their travel guides tightly, while others huddled close to their tour guides, hanging on every word about the ancient fortress that had withstood 26 sieges throughout its storied history. The air carried the haunting echo of bagpipes from a street performer below, the traditional melody weaving through the narrow winds and closes of the old town, mixing with the gentle rustling of amber leaves in the brisk morning wind. Around the castle's mighty walls, seagulls wheeled and cried, their white wings catching glints of the emerging sun as they soared past the iconic clock tower of the royal palace. The morning dew glistened on the black iron cannons that had stood sentinel for generations, including the famous Mons Meg, the medieval supergun that had once been the pride of Scotland's artillery. These silent witnesses to history seemed to stand even prouder on this particular morning, as if sensing the dramatic events that would soon unfold beneath their watchful gaze. Inside the castle walls, the morning ritual of the Royal Regiment of Scotland was underway with clockwork precision. In the guard room, soldiers prepared for their daily duties with methodical care, each movement refined by centuries of military tradition. The smell of boot polish and pressed wool filled the air as the guards meticulously prepared their uniforms. Boots were polished until they reflected like dark mirrors, uniforms pressed with razor-sharp creases, and brass buttons burnished until they gleamed like newly minted gold. The regiment's proud motto, Nemo me impune licessit, no one provokes me with impunity, seemed to echo silently through the stone corridors, a reminder of the solemn duty they carried. Senior guards briefed their younger counterparts, their voices low but clear in the morning quiet. Remember, a veteran sergeant instructed, his weathered face reflecting years of service. You're not just standing guard. You're holding the line of history itself. Every tourist who walks through these gates isn't just seeing a man in uniform. They're seeing 300 years of regimental history. The younger soldiers nodded, understanding the weight of their responsibility. Each of them knew they weren't simply soldiers. They were living embodiments of Scottish military tradition, a proud legacy stretching back through the mists of time to the days of Robert the Bruce and beyond. The castle kitchens had already been active for hours, preparing for the day ahead. The aroma of freshly baked scones and brewing tea wafted through the ancient corridors, mingling with the crisp morning air. Kitchen staff moved efficiently through their space, knowing they would soon be serving hundreds of visitors eager to taste traditional Scottish fare. The castle's famous tea room, with its spectacular views over the city, was being readied for another busy day. Outside, tour guides in their weathered tartan scarves gathered near the portcullis, warming their hands on paper cups of strong Scottish tea as they prepared for another day of storytelling. Their well-rehearsed tales of battles, betrayals, and royal intrigue would soon fill the air, bringing the castle's rich history to life for visitors from around the globe. Some practiced their scripts, while others shared stories of memorable tours and unusual questions from past visitors. Near the famous Half Moon Battery, early bird tourists already clustered in small groups, their excited chatter bouncing off the ancient stones as they gazed in wonder at the panoramic views of Edinburgh spread out below. The city itself was awakening, its spires and monuments emerging from the morning mist, like ships on a cloudy sea. From this elevated vantage point, you could trace the elegant sweep of Princes Street Gardens, the Gothic rocket of the Scott Monument, and the distant hills of Arthur's Seat, and the Salisbury Crags. The morning light painted everything in shades of gold and amber, creating a scene that seemed lifted from the pages of a historical romance. In the distance, early morning trains pulled into Waverley Station, bringing more visitors to Scotland's historic capital. The castle gift shop staff arrived, unlocking the heavy wooden doors and arranging displays of tartan scarves, Scottish shortbread, and miniature bottles of single malt whiskey. They carefully adjusted the displays of clan crests and family tartans, knowing that many visitors would be eager to discover their Scottish heritage. The aroma of fresh coffee began to waft from the castle cafe, mixing with the crisp morning air and the ancient smell of stone and history that permeated every corner of the fortress. Little did anyone know that on this misty morning, these historic grounds would become the stage for a clash between arrogance and honor, between disrespect and dignity, that would soon capture the world's attention. The ancient stones of Edinburgh Castle had witnessed countless dramas throughout their long history, battles and sieges, coronations and conspiracies. But today they would witness a different kind of conflict, one that would remind everyone of the enduring power of tradition and respect in our modern age. As the morning mist slowly lifted, the stage was set for an encounter that would soon be shared across the globe. At his post near the Crown Square entrance, Callum Macpherson stood as motionless as the ancient stones around him, his 6'3" frame cutting an impressive figure against the castle's weathered walls. At 26, he was one of the youngest members of the Royal Regiment of Scotland to earn this prestigious posting, but his bearing suggested experience far beyond his years. The morning sun glinted off his polished brass buttons and the regimental insignia on his Glengarry bonnet, while his perfectly pressed ceremonial uniform spoke of hours of meticulous preparation. The distinctive red and green Macpherson tartan visible beneath his sporran added a personal touch of Highland heritage to his official regalia. Callum's path to this position had been anything but ordinary. Born in a small Highland village near Inverness, he'd grown up on tales of Scottish military history, told by his grandfather, a decorated veteran of the Black Watch Regiment. Those stories, shared over peat fires on cold Highland nights, had sparked a flame in young Callum's heart, a deep respect for tradition and service that had only grown stronger with time. His grandfather's medals, proudly displayed in the family home, had been like sacred relics to him as a child, each one carrying a story of bravery and dedication that had shaped his understanding of duty. After graduating with honors from the University of Aberdeen, where he'd studied Scottish history, he'd chosen military service over a comfortable academic career, despite his professor's protests. His thesis on the evolution of Scottish military traditions had earned him high praise, but Callum knew that living these traditions would mean more than merely writing about them. The decision had been crystallized during a visit to Edinburgh Castle in his final year, watching the guards with a mixture of admiration and nascent purpose. His fellow guards often joked that Callum had been born in the wrong century. He possessed an old-world sense of honor that seemed almost anachronistic in today's fast-paced, selfie-obsessed world. Yet it was precisely this dedication to tradition that had earned him this coveted position. During his training, he'd broken several regimental records in drill precision and ceremonial performance. His commanding officer had noted in his last evaluation that Callum embodies the very spirit of the regiment, combining unwavering discipline with a deep understanding of the historical significance of his role. Standing at attention, Callum's dark blue eyes scanned the growing crowd with practiced discretion. Years of training had honed this skill to perfection, the ability to observe everything while appearing to focus on nothing. He'd learned early in his posting that while a guard must appear statue-like, situational awareness was crucial. Through countless hours of practice, he'd mastered the art of remaining perfectly still while maintaining acute awareness of his surroundings. Every movement in his peripheral vision was noted, every sound catalogued and assessed, all while maintaining the stoic demeanor expected of his position. The weight of his ceremonial Enfield rifle, though substantial, felt natural in his hands after countless hours of drill practice. His white gloves, spotless despite the morning mist, gripped the weapon in the prescribed position, perfect parallel to his immaculately pressed trousers. The morning's inspection had been particularly thorough, with his sergeant paying special attention to every detail, from the shine of his shoes to the angle of his belt buckle. Callum had taken extra care today, spending an additional hour ensuring every aspect of his uniform was perfect. Something in his soldier's intuition told him this wouldn't be an ordinary day. Behind his disciplined exterior, Callum's mind was active with thoughts of the day ahead. Experience had taught him that tourist season brought both rewards and challenges. He genuinely appreciated the visitors' interest in Scottish history and tradition. It was, after all, what had drawn him to this role. Yet there were always those who saw the guards as mere props for their holiday photos, failing to understand the deep historical significance of their position. Just yesterday, he'd maintained his composure while a group of teenagers tried to provoke a reaction, their attempts at humor falling flat against his professional dignity. Earlier that morning, he'd overheard a young guide explaining to her tour group about the guards' role in protecting the Scottish crown jewels and the Stone of Destiny. The pride he felt in that moment had reinforced his sense of purpose. These weren't just symbolic duties. They represented a direct link to centuries of Scottish heritage, a connection to every guard who had stood this post before him. The Stone of Destiny, in particular, held special significance for Callum. His grandfather had told him stories of its return to Scotland in 1996, a moment of profound national pride. A light breeze carried the scent of heather from the castle gardens, reminding Callum of his childhood home in the Highlands. His father, a local police officer, had always stressed the importance of public service, while his mother, a history teacher, had nurtured his love for Scottish tradition. Both had beamed with pride when he'd first donned his ceremonial uniform, understanding that their son had found his true calling. His younger sister, now studying at Edinburgh University, often brought her friends to see him on duty, proud to point out her brother standing guard over Scotland's heritage. The morning crowd was growing larger now, and Callum could hear the excited chatter of tourists in various languages. Through experience, he'd learned to distinguish between those who approached with respect and those who might pose a challenge to his composure. Years of training had taught him how to maintain his dignity and discipline regardless of provocations, a skill that would soon be tested more severely than ever before. He'd handled difficult situations before, but nothing had prepared him for what this day would bring. As he stood there, ramrod straight and unwavering, Callum embodied not just his own dedication to duty, but the collective pride of generations of Scottish soldiers who had served before him. Little did he know that in just a few hours, his commitment to these values would be challenged in a way that would test every aspect of his training and character, creating a moment that would come to symbolize the eternal clash between tradition and disrespect in our modern world. The morning unfolded like any other at Edinburgh Castle, following rhythms established through centuries of tradition. Callum had arrived at the guardhouse 2 hours before his shift, as was his custom, meticulously preparing every aspect of his uniform. The pre-dawn quiet had been punctuated only by the soft sounds of boots being polished and uniforms being pressed, as he and his fellow guards readied themselves for another day of duty. "Looking sharp as ever, McPherson," Sergeant Ross had commented during morning inspection, his experienced eyes scrutinizing every detail. The sergeant, a 20-year veteran of the regiment, had a well-earned reputation for detecting even the smallest uniform infractions. His approval was never given lightly, making his nod of satisfaction all the more meaningful. "Remember, we've got 3 tour groups from the cruise ships today. The Americans tend to be enthusiastic." The first wave of tourists had already begun their predictable routines. Smartphones appeared like magic wands, pointing at every historic feature and uniformed guard. A group of Japanese tourists politely asked their guide if photos were permitted, while a family from Germany consulted their guidebook, the father pointing out architectural details to his fascinated children. These were the moments Callum appreciated, genuine interest in the castle's heritage and traditions. From his post, Callum could observe the familiar daily choreography of castle life. The tour guides in their tartan scarves gathered near the Great Hall, sharing their morning coffee, and coordinating their routes to avoid overcrowding at popular spots. Gift shop staff wheeled out their display of "Kiss Me I'm Scottish" t-shirts and clan heritage certificates, arranging everything just so, The castle cafe's morning delivery arrived, bringing fresh supplies of shortbread and scones, their sweet aroma mixing with the crisp morning air. A pair of ravens, part of the castle's resident colony, strutted across the cobblestones near Callum's feet, unperturbed by his presence. Local legend held that if the ravens ever left the castle, it would fall, a tale Callum had heard countless times during his childhood visits. These particular birds had become familiar with his presence, often keeping him company during his long shifts of motionless vigilance. The usual attempts to provoke a reaction had already begun. "Do you ever smile?" asked a young tourist, her friend giggling behind her phone camera. "Maybe he's sleeping with his eyes open," another suggested, waving his hand in front of Callum's face. These were the standard, almost scripted interactions that every guard learned to expect. Callum had long since mastered the art of maintaining his composure, his mind focused on the deeper significance of his role, rather than the daily provocations. A school group from Aberdeen filed past, their teacher attempting to maintain order while explaining the historical significance of the Crown Square. "The guards here protect our nation's greatest treasures," she explained, her voice carrying clearly to Callum's position. "The honors of Scotland, our crown jewels, and the stone of destiny itself." The children's wide-eyed attention reminded Callum of his own first visit to the castle. When he'd stood in awe of the guards he now called colleagues. Two of his fellow guards, Wallace and MacDonald, marched past during the changing of positions, their movements precisely synchronized. The ceremony, though small, drew the usual crowd of onlookers, cameras clicking rapidly to capture the moment. Callum knew his own relief would come in 3 hours, but for now, he remained the living statue that tourists expected to see. The castle's daily routine flowed around him like a well-choreographed dance. The antique 1 o'clock gun was being prepared for its daily firing, a tradition dating back to 1861 when it helped ships in the Forth set their maritime clocks. Technicians inspected the modern sound system that would soon play bagpipe music near the castle entrance. The gift shop manager adjusted the display of clan tartans, preparing for another day of tourists discovering their Scottish heritage, real or imagined. Senior tour guide Margaret MacLeod, a fixture at the castle for over 2 decades, passed by with her morning group. "The regiment stationed here," she explained in her warm Highland lilt, "carries on a tradition of service stretching back centuries. Each guard you see represents not just military precision, but the living history of Scotland itself." Callum allowed himself a moment of pride at her words, though his expression remained impassive. A young boy, no more than 7, broke away from his parents to stand beside Callum, attempting to mimic his stance. "Look, Dad, I'm a guard too," he exclaimed proudly. These were the moments that reminded Callum why he chose this path. The genuine appreciation for tradition, the spark of inspiration in young eyes, the connection to something greater than himself. Little did Callum know that this ordinary morning, with its familiar rhythms and predictable tourists, was about to transform into something unprecedented. The comfortable routine he'd grown accustomed to would soon be shattered by an encounter that would test not only his training, but the very principles he'd sworn to uphold. As the morning wore on, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would turn this typical day into one that would be remembered long after the echoes of the 1 o'clock gun had faded. The atmosphere shifted subtly around 11 o'clock when a boisterous group emerged from the castle's main entrance into Crown Square. Led by Bradley Cooper, no relation to the actor as he'd already announced loudly to several other tourists, a 34-year-old tech entrepreneur from Silicon Valley, the group stood out immediately. Their designer clothes and casual disregard for their surroundings marked them as different from the usual respectful tourists who visited the historic fortress. Bradley, wearing limited edition sneakers that cost more than most people's monthly rent and designer sunglasses despite the overcast Scottish sky, carried himself with the unmistakable air of someone who believed money could buy anything, including the right to ignore local customs and traditions. His perfectly styled hair and carefully cultivated 3-day stubble suggested someone more accustomed to boardrooms than historical sites. "This is such a waste of time," he announced to his entourage, his voice carrying across the square with deliberate volume. "We could be hitting the whiskey distilleries instead of looking at old rocks." His companions, a mix of fellow tech executives and social media influencers, laughed on cue. They were all part of what Bradley called his European Legacy Tour, though it seemed more focused on creating viral content than appreciating any actual legacy. Among his group was Jake Sullivan, his company's marketing director, constantly filming with a high-end camera for their corporate social media channels. "The followers are going to love this, Brad," Jake assured him, adjusting his camera settings. "Nothing gets engagement like messing with these traditional tourist spots." Lisa Chen, a famous travel influencer with millions of followers, nodded in agreement while carefully framing her selfies against the castle walls. The group had already made their presence felt throughout Edinburgh. The previous day, they'd been asked to leave a traditional tea room after Bradley insisted on making a TikTok video mocking the quaint and outdated ceremony of afternoon tea. Now, with their hangovers barely subdued by expensive coffees, they were ready to turn Edinburgh Castle into their personal content studio. "Hey, check this out," Bradley called out, pulling up something on his phone. "There's this viral video from London where some guy got a reaction from one of those guard dudes, got like millions of views." He showed the video to his companions who gathered around excitedly. "We could totally do better than that. I mean, this is just some Scottish castle, not even Buckingham Palace." A few other tourists nearby shot disapproving looks at the group, but Bradley and his friends remained oblivious to the growing discomfort their behavior was causing. Two elderly Scottish women in their Sunday best, who had come to visit the war memorial after church, shook their heads in quiet disapproval. A family from Canada quietly guided their children to a different part of the square. "I bet these guys aren't even real soldiers," Bradley continued, his voice getting louder as he warmed to his performance. "Probably just minimum wage actors hired to stand around for the tourists." His friends laughed, though a few seemed slightly uncomfortable with the increasing volume and obvious disrespect. Tom Richards, Bradley's chief technology officer, shifted uneasily but said nothing, unwilling to challenge his boss's behavior. Lisa positioned herself for another selfie, her practiced influencer smile in place. "My followers are going to flip when they see what we're about to do," she said, adjusting her designer Scottish tartan scarf, worn more as a fashion statement than out of any respect for tradition. "This is exactly the kind of content that goes viral." Bradley took another sip from his premium coffee cup, his eyes fixed on Callum's stoic figure. "These guys think they're so special with their fancy uniforms and serious faces," he scoffed. "I make more in a day than they make in a year. Let's see how serious they stay when faced with some real entertainment." He pulled out his phone, opening his live streaming app while checking his hair and his phone's reflection. The group's energy was building, feeding off their leader's bravado. More tourists were beginning to notice them, some moving away while others lingered, sensing the potential for drama. A tour guide nearby tried to continue her historical explanation, but her voice was increasingly drowned out by the group's loud commentary and artificial laughter. "Time to show everyone how ridiculous this whole thing is," Bradley announced, straightening his designer jacket. "Watch and learn, folks. This is how you create viral content." He handed his coffee to Jake, adjusted his sunglasses, and began walking toward Callum's post with exaggerated swagger. His every movement screamed of someone who had never been told no in his professional life, and had forgotten that different rules might apply outside his tech bubble. The morning's peaceful routine was about to be shattered. The familiar rhythm of castle life, the respectful tourists, the informative tours, the solemn ceremonies, was about to collide with a force that represented everything it stood against: entitlement, disrespect, and the relentless pursuit of viral fame at any cost. Bradley approached Callum's post with the calculated swagger of someone performing for an audience, his phone held high to capture every moment for his live stream. "Hey there, Mr. Serious," he called out, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "Let me guess, they picked you because you're the best at playing statue?" His followers, watching the live stream, began flooding the chat with laughing emojis and encouraging comments. Behind him, Jake positioned himself for the best camera angle, while Lisa prepared to capture reactions for her Instagram stories. The rest of their group spread out in a loose semicircle, creating an impromptu stage for Bradley's performance. Tom, still uncomfortable with the situation, lingered at the back, pretending to be absorbed in his phone. "You know what I think?" Bradley continued, moving closer to Callum. I think under all that fancy dress-up costume, you're just dying to have some fun. Come on, give us a smile. My followers want to see if you're actually human under there. He waved his hand in front of Callum's face, the expensive watch on his wrist glinting in the late morning sun. Callum remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, though his jaw might have tightened slightly, a minute detail noticed only by the most observant onlookers. His training had prepared him for such provocations, but there was something particularly grating about Bradley's performative disrespect. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by Bradley's loud voice and theatrical gestures. Some pulled out their phones, sensing the potential for drama, while others watched with obvious disapproval. An American couple quickly ushered their children away, the mother muttering, "Some people have no respect." "Maybe he doesn't speak English," Bradley announced to his live stream audience. "Let me try something else." He pulled out his wallet and made a show of extracting a 50-pound note. "Hey buddy, here's some motivation for you. Do a little dance and it's yours." He waved the money in front of Callum's face, playing to his digital audience. "Oh my God, Brad, this is gold!" Lisa exclaimed, her perfectly manicured fingers flying over her phone's screen as she posted updates. "My engagement rates are going through the roof!" The group's excitement seemed to feed Bradley's performance, pushing him to escalate further. A Scottish family nearby watched with growing indignation. "Disgraceful," the father muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Think they can buy anything with their American dollars." His teenage daughter filmed the scene, but her expression showed she was documenting bad behavior rather than entertainment. Bradley, encouraged by his live stream comments, decided to up the ante. He pulled out his phone and started playing "Scotland the Brave" through its speakers, the tinny sound clashing jarringly with the castle's dignified atmosphere. "Come on, big guy. Isn't this your jam? Show us some traditional Scottish moves." The morning tour groups tried to continue their visits, but Bradley's performance was becoming impossible to ignore. Tour guides attempted to steer their groups away from the scene, their practiced speeches about castle history drowned out by Bradley's increasingly theatrical taunts. "Look at him! Not even a blink!" Bradley exclaimed, moving to stand directly in Callum's line of sight. "I bet if I offered him £1,000 he'd do a Highland fling right here." He pulled out more bills, making it rain around Callum's immaculately polished boots. The money settled on the ancient cobblestones, a jarring symbol of wealth attempting to buy compliance. Two castle staff members exchanged concerned glances, one reaching for his radio. They'd dealt with disrespectful tourists before, but something about Bradley's calculated performance, designed specifically for social media impact, felt different, more deliberate, more provocative. "Sir," a middle-aged tour guide finally spoke up, her Scottish accent thick with disapproval. "Perhaps you'd be interested in learning about the historical significance of the Royal Regiment?" It was a diplomatic attempt to redirect Bradley's attention, but he waved her off with a dismissive laugh. "Historical significance? Please, this is the 21st century. Everything's content now, sweetheart." Bradley's dismissal of the guide sent a ripple of murmurs through the growing crowd. Even some of his own group seemed to wince at his tone. Callum maintained his composure, but those close enough might have noticed his grip tightening slightly on his ceremonial rifle. His training played through his mind. You represent centuries of tradition. Never let momentary provocations override your duty. Still, there was something particularly challenging about maintaining composure while being turned into unwilling content for someone's social media circus. The tension in Crown Square was building. Tourist groups lingered longer than usual, sensing that they were witnessing something beyond the usual tourist guard interaction. Bradley's livestream comments encouraged him to push further, each new notification feeding his determination to get a reaction. The stage was being set for something more than just another viral video attempt. This was rapidly becoming a clash between two very different worlds, one of ancient tradition and honor, the other of clicks, views, and viral fame at any cost. Frustrated by Callum's unwavering composure, Bradley's performance took a darker turn. "Hey everyone," he announced to his live stream, adjusting his designer sunglasses. Let's see what it takes to make a Scottish guard lose his cool. He handed his phone to Jake, ensuring every moment would be captured from the perfect angle. This is going to be epic. Lisa chimed in from behind her camera. We're trending locally already. The #sign Scottish Guard challenge is taking off. Her excitement seemed to fuel Bradley's determination. The tech entrepreneur's carefully curated image of casual confidence was slipping, revealing something harder and more desperate underneath, the need to create content at any cost. Maybe he's just a mannequin, Bradley announced loudly, circling Callum like a predator. Let's test that theory. He pulled out his premium coffee, still steaming in its expensive cup. The crowd tensed, some already guessing what might come next. A few people started filming, though their expressions suggested they were documenting a crime rather than entertainment. Tom, Bradley's CTO, finally found his voice. Brad, maybe we should... But Bradley cut him off with a sharp look. What's wrong, Tom? Worried about our social media metrics dropping? The words carried a clear warning about corporate hierarchy, and Tom fell silent, though he took a step back from the group. Moving with exaggerated swagger, Bradley held his coffee cup at shoulder height, making sure Jake's camera had the perfect angle. Let's conduct a little experiment in Scottish reactions, he announced to his stream. The coffee cup tilted slowly, deliberately, a few drops falling near Callum's spotless boots. Sir, a castle staff member called out, stepping forward. That's enough. This is a historic site, not a film studio. But Bradley ignored him, his focus entirely on his performance. The live stream chat was exploding with reactions, driving him forward like a performer chasing applause. A mother pulled her young son away, saying loudly in an Edinburgh accent, "Come away, Jamie. That's not how we behave in someone else's home." Her words carried pointed meaning, but Bradley was too absorbed in his performance to notice the growing disapproval around him. "Look at this guy's dedication," Bradley exclaimed, moving closer. "But everyone has a breaking point, right? Even the famous Scottish discipline must have its limits." He was playing to his audience now, his voice taking on the exaggerated tone of a wildlife documentary narrator. Watch as we observe the Scottish Guard in his natural habitat. The crowd had grown larger, forming a loose circle around the scene. Some were filming, others watching with expressions ranging from disgust to morbid fascination. Two teenage girls in school uniforms whispered to each other, one already typing rapidly on her phone. Dad works at the Herald. He'll want to know about this. Lisa, still capturing everything for her social channels, called out, "The engagement on this is insane. We're getting picked up by major content aggregators." Her excitement seemed to isolate the group further from the growing public disapproval around them. Bradley, emboldened by the online attention, stepped closer to Callum. "Maybe we should test your reflexes," he taunted, moving the coffee cup in elaborate patterns. "They say Scottish guards have the best training in the world. Let's fact-check that, shall we?" His movements became more erratic, coffee sloshing dangerously close to Callum's uniform. A veteran tour guide, who had been leading tours at the castle for over 2 decades, tried to intervene. "Young man, that uniform represents centuries of..." But Bradley spoke over her, louder now, playing to his virtual audience. "Centuries of standing around looking pretty? Come on, this is the age of social media. Nobody cares about old traditions anymore." Those words sent a ripple through the crowd. Even some tourists who had been passively filming began to lower their phones, the discomfort evident on their faces. A group of Scottish schoolchildren on a field trip watched wide-eyed, their teacher frantically trying to usher them away from the scene. Callum remained statue still, but subtle signs of tension were visible to those who knew where to look. A slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his grip on the ceremonial rifle. His training had prepared him for many things, but this calculated, performed disrespect, engineered specifically for viral fame, was testing the limits of his discipline. The atmosphere in Crown Square had transformed completely. The usual tourist buzz was replaced by a tense silence, broken only by Bradley's increasingly theatrical commentary and the artificial laughs of his entourage. Even the ravens, usually unflappable residents of the castle, had retreated to higher perches as if sensing the coming storm. The situation balanced on a knife's edge. Bradley's live stream numbers were climbing, each new viewer pushing him closer to crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The ancient stones of Edinburgh Castle had witnessed centuries of history, but now they were about to bear witness to a very modern kind of conflict, one where tradition and dignity faced off against the relentless pursuit of viral infamy. What happened next would later be viewed millions of times across dozens of social platforms, but no video could fully capture the tension that crackled through the air of Crown Square. Bradley, his face flushed with the thrill of growing viewer counts, took his performance to a dangerous new level. "Ladies and gentlemen of the internet," he announced, playing to his virtual audience, "let's make history." He raised his coffee cup higher, the morning light catching the steam still rising from it. "They say these guards never move, never flinch, never break character. But I say everyone has a price, or a breaking point." The live stream chat exploded with a mix of encouragement and horrified warnings. Jake, still filming, called out the viewer numbers. "We just crossed 100,000 live viewers, Brad. This is going viral in real time." Lisa frantically coordinated with her social media team, knowing this could be the content that would define her brand. A few drops of coffee splashed deliberately close to Callum's polished boots, leaving dark marks on the ancient cobblestones. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "Stop it." But Bradley was too invested in his performance to hear the rising chorus of disapproval. "Look at him. Not even a blink." Bradley circled closer, his designer shoes scuffing the time-worn stones. "Maybe we should conduct a little science experiment. How many drops of coffee does it take to make a Scottish guard crack?" He tilted the cup further, letting more drops fall, each one a deliberate provocation. Tom, the CTO, finally broke ranks. "Brad, this isn't cool anymore. We're going to have PR issues." But Bradley cut him off with a sharp laugh. "PR issues? This is PR gold. We're trending nationwide." His voice had taken on a manic edge, the pursuit of viral fame overwhelming any remaining sense of decorum. Callum stood resolute, though those closest might have noticed the subtle whitening of his knuckles on his ceremonial rifle. His training ran through his mind like a mantra. Stand firm, stand proud, stand for something greater than yourself. Yet each drop of coffee that spattered near his feet tested those principles in ways his instructors had never imagined. An elderly Scottish woman in her Sunday best pushed forward through the crowd, her voice cutting through the tension. "Have you no shame, young man? This is sacred ground you're standing on." But Bradley barely glanced at her, focused entirely on his phone's growing engagement metrics. "Sacred ground?" he scoffed, playing to his audience. "This is the 21st century, Grandma. Everything's content now." He took another step closer to Callum, deliberately crossing the marked line that separated visitors from the guard's post. "Let's see what happens when we break the fourth wall." The castle staff were now mobilizing, with security personnel speaking urgently into their radios. But they were still making their way through the dense crowd that had gathered to witness the spectacle. A group of Scottish schoolchildren watched from the sidelines, their young faces a mix of confusion and distress as they witnessed this assault on their heritage. Bradley's own group had started to fragment. Several members drifted backward, their earlier enthusiasm dampened by the growing hostility from the crowd. Even Lisa, despite the engagement numbers soaring on her posts, had lowered her phone slightly, uncertainty finally crossing her perfectly curated expression. "Maybe he needs some encouragement," Bradley announced, reaching into his wallet again. He pulled out a handful of 50-pound notes, making a show of waving them in Callum's face. "Come on, soldier boy. I'll make it worth your while. Give us a smile, a dance, anything." When Callum remained impassive, Bradley's frustration peaked. He crumpled the notes and tossed them at the guard's feet, where they landed among the coffee stains on the ancient cobblestones. The crowd's murmurs turned to angry exclamations. A young Scottish man started forward, only to be held back by his friends. "Still nothing?" Bradley's voice took on an ugly edge. "Well then, let's try something that'll definitely get a reaction. My followers deserve a grand finale." He raised his coffee cup higher, positioning himself directly in front of Callum, close enough that the guard could smell the expensive artisanal brew. The tension in Crown Square reached a breaking point. Phones were raised everywhere, recording what everyone sensed would be a moment of infamy. The ravens that usually patrolled the square had gone silent, as if the very air had become too heavy with anticipation for even their calls. It was no longer just about a guard and a tourist. It had become a battle between two worlds, one of ancient honor and tradition, the other of instant gratification and viral fame. The very stones of Edinburgh Castle seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see which would prevail. The crowd in Crown Square had swelled to several hundred people, their collective energy transforming the usually serene space into an arena of tension. The usual tourist chatter had given way to something darker, more volatile, as Bradley's increasingly aggressive display split the onlookers into distinct camps. The ancient stones of the castle, which had witnessed everything from medieval sieges to royal coronations, now bore witness to a very modern kind of conflict. "Someone needs to stop this nonsense," declared Margaret Campbell, a retired Edinburgh schoolteacher who had been visiting the castle after Sunday service. Her words, spoken in a clear Highland accent, carried across the square. "In all my 40 years of bringing students here, I've never seen such deliberate disrespect." Several others around her nodded in agreement, their faces tight with disapproval. Margaret clutched her handbag tighter, her knuckles white with anger. "My grandfather served in these regiments," she added, her voice trembling. "He'd be turning in his grave." The social media dynamics were equally divided, creating a virtual battleground that paralleled the physical tension in the square. Bradley's livestream comments fluctuated between encouragement and outrage. "Push him further," some viewers demanded, while others typed furious messages. "This is disgusting," and "show some respect." The conflict was spreading beyond the physical space of the castle, igniting debates across multiple platforms about tradition, respect, and the limits of social media entertainment. Hashtags began trending, Edinburgh Castle disgrace competing with guard challenge. A group of young Scottish men, still in their rugby jerseys from a morning match at Murrayfield, watched with growing anger. "He wouldn't try this at Buckingham Palace," one muttered, his fists clenching. "Thinks because we're Scottish our traditions mean less." His teammates placed restraining hands on his shoulders, though their own faces showed similar indignation. The team captain, whose grandfather had served in the Royal Regiment of Scotland, was quietly filming everything. "This needs to be documented," he said grimly. "People need to see how our heritage is being treated." Families with children began retreating to the edges of the square, parents using the moment as an impromptu lesson in respect and cultural awareness. "That's not how we behave," one mother told her wide-eyed daughter. "Remember what I told you about respecting our heritage?" The little girl nodded solemnly, clutching her recently purchased toy Highland cow. Nearby, a father was explaining to his son about his own military service, his voice thick with emotion as he watched the guard endure the mockery. Tour guides had stopped their regular programs, their carefully rehearsed speeches about Scottish history rendered pointless by the unfolding drama. Instead, many began quietly explaining to their groups the significance of the guard's role and the depth of tradition being mocked. "These men represent over 3 centuries of Scottish military history," one guide explained to her stunned Japanese tourists. "What you're witnessing is more than just harassment. It's an attack on our cultural heritage." Another guide, a retired sergeant himself, was barely containing his anger as he translated the situation for a group of German visitors. The castle staff were divided between crowd control and documentation. Security cameras swiveled to capture the scene, while staff members recorded the incident on their phones for official reports. Behind the scenes, urgent messages were being relayed to senior management, and some whispered to the regiment's command. The gift shop staff had abandoned their posts to watch through the windows, their faces reflecting the growing tension outside. "I've got the Herald on the line," one staff member whispered to another, holding his phone tight against his ear. "They're asking if we want to comment on the viral situation developing at the castle." News of the confrontation was spreading beyond the castle walls, drawing media attention that would soon make the incident impossible to contain. Local news vans were already being spotted at the castle's entrance, drawn by the social media buzz. Local visitors seemed to take the provocation personally, their reactions charged with generations of Scottish pride. "That's someone's son standing there," an elderly man in a veteran's beret pointed out, his voice thick with emotion. "Someone's boy doing his duty with dignity, and this fool treats him like a circus attraction." His words rippled through the nearby crowd, humanizing the stoic figure at the center of the drama. International tourists reacted according to their own cultural perspectives, creating a tapestry of global opinions. A group of American veterans watched with obvious disapproval, one shaking his head saying, "This isn't what we came to Scotland to see." German tourists discussed the importance of respecting historical institutions, while a French family debated the intersection of tradition and modern media culture. A group of Japanese schoolchildren watched in silent shock, their teacher quietly explaining the concept of respect in different cultures. Even Bradley's own audience was turning against him. Comments on his live stream began shifting dramatically. "This isn't funny anymore," and "You're going too far," started appearing more frequently. His viewer count was still rising, but the tone had changed. People were now watching in horrified fascination rather than entertainment. Social media analytics showed the hashtags trending negative, with more people condemning than supporting his actions. Local business owners from the Royal Mile, hearing about the commotion, began appearing at the edges of the crowd, their faces concerned. "This'll be bad for tourism," the owner of a nearby whiskey shop muttered to his colleague. "Americans like him make all their countrymen look bad." The economic implications of viral infamy were not lost on those whose livelihoods depended on the castle's dignity. Shop owners began sharing the scene on their business social media accounts, unanimously condemning the disrespect being shown to their heritage. A group of students from the University of Edinburgh, who had been sketching the castle architecture for a class project, switched to documenting the scene unfolding before them. "This is going to end up in a sociology thesis," one remarked, rapidly taking notes. "Modern media versus traditional institutions, you couldn't script better source material." Their professor, who had been supervising the sketching session, was already outlining a potential case study on social media's impact on historical institutions. Through it all, Callum maintained his stance, though the energy radiating from the crowd must have been almost physical in its intensity. The public's reaction was becoming its own force, a mounting pressure that would soon demand resolution. The ancient walls of Edinburgh Castle had witnessed centuries of Scottish history, but now they were watching a very modern battle unfold, one where the weapons were phones and social media, but the stakes were as real as any historical conflict. Through the tense atmosphere of Crown Square, a commanding presence emerged from the direction of the Great Hall. Colonel Ian MacLeod, decorated veteran of the Royal Regiment of Scotland and current military historian at Edinburgh University, made his way through the crowd with measured steps. At 68, his bearing still reflected decades of military service. Straight-backed and purposeful, his regimental tie perfectly knotted despite the informal nature of his Sunday castle visit. The colonel hadn't planned to visit the castle today. He'd been in his office at the university, working on his latest book about Scottish military traditions, when urgent messages about the unfolding situation began flooding his phone. Former colleagues from the regiment, knowing he lived nearby, had alerted him to the escalating scene. "Someone needs to set this right," one text read, accompanied by a link to the viral livestream. His appearance caused an immediate ripple through the crowd. Several castle staff members straightened instinctively, recognizing his authority even in his civilian clothes. The medals pinned to his tweed jacket caught the morning light. Campaign medals from conflicts that had tested not just courage, but the very principles of duty and honor that were now being mockingly challenged. "Excuse me," he said quietly, but his voice carried the weight of command. The crowd parted naturally before him, creating a path toward the center of the confrontation. Those who recognized him began whispering to others, "That's Colonel MacLeod, and he commanded the regiment here for years." Even those who didn't know him could sense his authority. It radiated from him like heat from stone walls on a summer evening. Bradley, still performing for his live stream audience, remained oblivious to the colonel's approach. "Maybe we should start a petition to replace these guys with animatronics," he was saying, waving his coffee cup dramatically. At least robots would be programmed to interact. His followers continued to send virtual gifs and encouraging comments, though an observant viewer might have noticed an increasing number of warnings in the chat. Someone important just showed up, and you might want to stop now. The colonel paused several feet from the scene, taking in every detail with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades training young soldiers. He noticed Callum's perfect stance, the slight tension in his jaw, the disciplined stillness that spoke of deep training and deeper commitment. Then his gaze shifted to Bradley, cataloging the expensive clothes, the carefully crafted social media persona, the desperate need for attention that drove such behavior. "Young man," the colonel spoke, his Highland accent thick with authority. "Do you have any idea what that uniform represents?" His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the square like a blade through butter. The livestream chat exploded with new comments as viewers sensed a dramatic turn in their entertainment. Bradley turned, ready with another quip, but something in the colonel's presence made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the rouse of metals, or the way other visitors stepped back respectfully, or simply the aura of command that surrounded the older man. For the first time since he'd begun his performance, Bradley's social media confidence wavered. "That young soldier you're treating as your personal entertainment?" the colonel continued, gesturing toward Callum. "He stands in a line of service stretching back through generations. Men who've died defending the very freedoms you're currently abusing." The colonel took another step forward, his eyes fixed on Bradley. "I've commanded men like him in places your social media followers couldn't find on a map." The square had fallen completely silent. Even the ravens, usually vocal contributors to the castle's atmosphere, seemed to be listening. The colonel's words carried across the courtyard, each one weighted with decades of service and sacrifice. Tour guides quietly translated for their international groups, understanding they were witnessing something significant. "When I was his age," the colonel gestured toward Callum, "I stood that same post. And when my father served, he stood it too. This isn't a tourist attraction, son. It's a living testament to duty, honor, and sacrifice." His voice carried not just authority, but a deep sadness at witnessing such disrespect for traditions he'd spent a lifetime upholding. Bradley's livestream followers were now rapidly changing sides, the chat filling with messages supporting the colonel. Even Lisa, still filming everything, had unconsciously lowered her phone, caught in the gravity of the moment. The colonel's presence had transformed the atmosphere from a social media circus to something more profound, a clash between superficial entertainment and deep-rooted tradition. "Those stripes on his sleeve," the colonel pointed to Callum's uniform. "They're not costume decorations. They're earned through dedication, discipline, and sacrifice. Something your virtual audience might not understand, but something every Scot here knows in their bones." He paused, letting his words sink in. The silence in Crown Square was absolute, hundreds of people holding their breath, waiting to see how this confrontation between old values and new media would resolve. Bradley's carefully curated social media persona cracked under the colonel's steady gaze. For a moment, he seemed to shrink, the expensive designer clothes and practiced swagger no longer providing their usual armor. But the addictive pull of viral fame proved too strong to resist. His livestream numbers were higher than ever, and in his world, engagement metrics trumped real-world dignity. "Look, Grandpa," Bradley said, trying to recapture his earlier bravado. "I respect your service and all that, but times have changed. This is about entertainment now. My followers want a show, and—" He raised his coffee cup again, the gesture more uncertain than before but still provocative. The colonel's response cut through the air like a Highland wind. "Entertainment?" His voice carried decades of command experience. "Let me tell you about entertainment, lad. 2 years ago, I watched a young guard like this one stand his post during a winter storm that would have sent you running to your heated hotel room. The tourists found that entertaining too, until they learned he was standing there to honor 3 of his mates who'd fallen in Afghanistan." A ripple went through the crowd. Several phones lowered, their owners suddenly uncomfortable with documenting what had become something far more serious than social media fodder. Bradley's own livestream chat was filling with messages urging him to stop, but he seemed trapped between his craving for viral fame and the growing weight of real-world consequences. You think that uniform's a costume? The colonel took another step forward, his medals catching the light. The regiment this young man represents has shed blood on battlefields from Waterloo to Helmand Province. His stance, the one you're mocking for your followers' amusement, is the same stance we've maintained guarding everything from crown jewels to fallen comrades. Bradley's hand wavered, coffee sloshing in his cup. His confident smirk had been replaced by something less certain, but his eyes kept darting to his phone where viewer numbers were reaching record heights. It's just content, he protested, his voice smaller now. Nobody takes it seriously. Nobody takes it seriously? The colonel's voice shifted, carrying not just authority but a deep sadness. Tell that to the mothers who've watched their sons master that stance before deploying. Tell it to the veterans who've stood guard over their brothers' coffins. Tell it to every Scot who understands that some traditions deserve respect, not because they're entertaining, but because they're sacred. The atmosphere in Crown Square had transformed completely. The earlier circus-like environment had given way to something heavier, more profound. Even the most casually interested tourists could sense they were witnessing something significant, a collision between superficial modern entertainment and deep-rooted tradition. Bradley's social media team had gone quiet. Lisa had stopped filming entirely, her carefully maintained influencer expression cracking with genuine emotion. Jake lowered his camera, unable to continue documenting what had become less entertainment and more public shame. Even Tom, who had been uncomfortable from the start, finally found his voice. Brad, man, let's just go. This isn't what we came for. But Bradley, trapped in the spotlight of his own making, made one final desperate attempt to salvage his performance. If these traditions are so important, he said, raising his coffee cup higher, let's test how seriously they take them. He turned back toward Callum, who remained motionless at his post, though his eyes now held a dangerous gleam. The colonel saw it coming. Perhaps his decades of military experience had taught him to read intent in the smallest gestures. Perhaps he simply understood that wounded pride often leads to rash actions. Either way, he moved with surprising speed for his age, stepping between Bradley and Callum just as the tech entrepreneur began to tip his coffee cup forward. Son, the colonel said, his voice carrying an edge that could have cut steel, I wouldn't do that. His eyes locked with Bradley's, and in that moment, centuries of military tradition faced off against the hollow pursuit of viral fame. Because if you do, you'll learn exactly how seriously we take our traditions here. The square fell absolutely silent. Even the ever-present ravens seemed to hold their calls. The ancient stones of Edinburgh Castle, which had witnessed countless confrontations over the centuries, now watched this very modern battle of wills reach its critical moment. Hundreds of phones captured the scene, but their owners barely breathed, knowing they were witnessing something that transcended mere social media content. Bradley's hand trembled, coffee rippling in its cup. His live stream numbers had never been higher, but suddenly they seemed meaningless compared to the weight of the colonel's gaze and the palpable disapproval emanating from the crowd. In this moment, all his carefully constructed online influence counted for nothing against the raw authenticity of genuine tradition and respect. The transformation happened in an instant. Bradley's hand trembled once more, then lowered, the coffee cup's descent marking the visible shift in power. His carefully crafted social media persona crumbled like ancient mortar, leaving him standing exposed, not as an influential content creator, but as a young man who had severely misjudged his situation. The live stream chat exploded with reactions, but not the kind Bradley had been seeking. Did he just back down? Finally, someone put him in his place. This is better than the prank he planned. The virtual audience that had encouraged his provocations now turned on him with the swift brutality unique to social media. His follower count was dropping in real time, each decrease another crack in his digital armor. Lisa, his social media manager, recognized the shift immediately. Her influencer instincts kicked in as she quickly distanced herself from Bradley, both physically and digitally. I want to apologize to everyone watching, she announced to her own followers. Camera now turned to face her. What we witnessed today was completely inappropriate, and I should have spoken up sooner. Her rapid pivot from accomplice to critic was a masterclass in social media survival. The colonel maintained his position, his presence a physical reminder of the weight of tradition. "You've made your choice, lad," he said, his voice carrying both authority and a hint of relief. "Though I suspect it wasn't really a choice at all. Some things still matter more than viral fame, whether you understand that yet or not." The crowd's energy transformed palpably. What had been tension now became something else, a collective release of breath, but also a surge of something stronger. Pride, perhaps, or vindication. The young Scottish rugby players who had been restraining themselves now stood taller, their faces showing fierce satisfaction. The elderly visitors nodded approvingly, some wiping discreet tears from their eyes. Tour guides who had been translating the confrontation in whispered tones to their international groups now spoke more freely. "This is what we mean when we talk about Scottish pride," one explained to her American tourists. "It's not just about kilts and bagpipes, it's about standing firm for what matters." Her words carried across the square, met with murmurs of agreement from other guides. Bradley's team scattered like leaves in a Highland wind. Jake lowered his camera completely, muttering about needing to process the footage. Tom, the uncomfortable CTO, finally found his corporate voice. "Brad, we need to think about the company's image here. This isn't playing well." He was already drafting damage control emails on his phone, trying to distance their tech startup from its founder's behavior. The castle staff had moved in closer now, their earlier uncertainty replaced with quiet confidence. The security team that had been awaiting instructions now stood ready, their purpose clear. A senior staff member stepped forward, her voice professional but firm. "Sir, I believe it's time for you to leave the premises. We can escort you to the exit." Bradley glanced around, seeking any support, but found none. His expensive sneakers scuffed against the ancient cobblestones as he took an uncertain step backward. The coffee cup, his weapon of choice in this failed attempt at viral fame, hung limply from his fingers. "I was just trying to create content," he mumbled, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Content?" The colonel's response carried decades of perspective. "Young man, what you've created today is a lesson, though perhaps not the one you intended." He gestured to the crowd, where phones were still recording, but now with a different purpose. "Everything you've done here will indeed go viral, but as a reminder that some traditions deserve respect, not mockery." The social media tide had turned completely. Bradley's live stream numbers were plummeting, while clips of the colonel's intervention were already spreading across multiple platforms. Hashtags were shifting from hashtag guard challenge to hashtag Scottish pride and hashtag tradition stands. The digital world, as fickle as a Scottish summer, had found a new hero in the elderly colonel who had stood for something real. Callum remained at his post, his stance as perfect as ever, but there was a subtle change in his bearing, a barely perceptible straightening of his already impeccable posture. The colonel caught this minimal shift and gave him an almost imperceptible nod, one soldier to another. The gesture spoke volumes about duty, honor, and the unspoken brotherhood of those who serve. The castle itself seemed to stand taller, its ancient stones witnesses to yet another victory, not of arms or siege engines this time, but of tradition over transient fame, of substance over spectacle. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across Crown Square, as if nature itself was marking this moment of restored balance. The castle's security team moved with practiced efficiency, forming a professional barrier between Bradley and the crowd. "This way, sir," the head of security said firmly, gesturing toward the exit. There was no room for argument in his tone, and Bradley, his social media empire crumbling in real time, finally seemed to understand the gravity of his situation. The security team had dealt with troublesome visitors before, but rarely had they seen someone's public persona collapse so completely in a matter of minutes. "Our company's legal team will be in touch," Tom announced, already shifting into damage control mode. "You'll need to sign some papers." The implications were clear. Bradley's position as CEO was likely as precarious as his social media following. Several board members were already calling, their names flashing on Tom's phone screen with increasing urgency. In the tech world, viral fame could make you, but viral infamy could break you just as quickly. The company's stock had already begun to fluctuate as news of the incident spread through financial circles. The colonel watched the proceedings with the steady gaze of someone who had seen many such confrontations, though perhaps none quite so modern in nature. Sometimes, he said to no one in particular, though his words carried across the square, the hardest battles are fought not with weapons, but with dignity. Several visitors nodded in agreement, understanding they had witnessed something more significant than a simple tourist disturbance. A group of veterans who had been quietly observing moved closer, forming an informal honor guard around their former commander. Lisa, still live streaming but now with a completely different narrative, was already reconstructing her role in the events. "This is why we need to think about the impact of our content," she told her followers, her influencer voice taking on a newly serious tone. "Today taught me something about respect and tradition that no amount of likes or shares can measure." Her rapid repositioning was a masterclass in social media crisis management. Behind the scenes, her agent was already fielding calls about potential speaking engagements on responsible influencing and cultural sensitivity and content creation. Castle staff had begun the process of returning the square to its normal state, though there was nothing normal about the energy that lingered in the air. The scattered money was collected and would be donated to the Royal Regiment of Scotland's Veterans Fund, a fitting end to Bradley's attempted display of wealth. Tour guides resumed their regular routes, though their scripts now included an impromptu addition about the importance of respecting military traditions. Some guides even began sharing personal stories about family members who had served, adding an intimate dimension to their historical narratives. Several news crews had arrived, drawn by the viral nature of the incident. A BBC Scotland reporter approached the colonel respectfully. "Sir, would you be willing to share your thoughts on what happened here today?" The colonel considered for a moment, then nodded. His measured response would later be quoted in numerous articles about the clash between social media culture and traditional values. Other networks jostled for position, recognizing that this story touched on deeper themes about modern society and traditional values. "What we witnessed today," he began, his Highland accent lending gravity to his words, "wasn't just about a guard and a tourist. It was about understanding that some things, duty, honor, tradition, can't be reduced to content for likes and shares." The reporter nodded, recognizing the soundbite that would lead evening news broadcasts across Scotland. In the background, international news crews were already translating his words for their respective audiences, understanding that this story would resonate far beyond Scottish borders. Bradley's remaining team members hustled him toward the exit, but the damage was done. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, unfollows, angry comments, messages from disappointed sponsors. The tech industry forums were already buzzing with discussions about leadership changes at his company. Venture capitalists who had once courted him now distanced themselves publicly. His attempt at viral fame had succeeded, but not in the way he'd planned. As he was escorted down the Royal Mile, local shop owners watched with barely concealed satisfaction, some even posting "Respect Our Heritage" signs in their windows. In the aftermath, an unexpected movement began among the witnesses. Visitors approached Callum's post, not to mock or challenge, but to show respect. Some offered simple nods, others quiet words of appreciation. A young girl in a school uniform placed her newly purchased castle guidebook at his feet, not as a provocation, but as a gesture of admiration. Her mother beamed with pride at her daughter's understanding. This spontaneous display of respect sparked a trend that would continue throughout the day, with visitors finding their own ways to show appreciation for the traditions they had seen defended. The colonel stayed in the square, speaking quietly with various visitors who approached him. To a group of American tourists, he explained the history of the Royal Regiment of Scotland, sharing personal anecdotes from his years of service. To local school children, he spoke about the importance of understanding and protecting their heritage, his words carrying the weight of lived experience. Each conversation helped transform what could have been merely a viral moment into a lasting lesson about respect and tradition, Teachers in the crowd took notes, already planning how to incorporate this incident into their lessons on Scottish history and civic responsibility. Social media platforms were ablaze with different versions of the incident, but for once the narrative was remarkably consistent. Hashtags like Tradition Matters and Scottish Pride dominated the trending lists. The castle's official social media accounts saw a surge in followers as people sought to learn more about the traditions they had seen defended so powerfully. Digital marketing experts began analyzing the incident as a case study in authentic content versus manufactured controversy. Local businesses along the Royal Mile quickly adapted to the moment. Gift shops began displaying books about Scottish military history more prominently. Tour companies adjusted their scripts to include more information about the castle's military traditions. Even the street performers modified their acts to show more respect for the castle's ceremonial aspects. Restaurant menus added historical notes about military traditions, and pub owners shared stories about the regiment's connection to their establishments. The castle staff held an impromptu meeting to discuss the incident, gathering in the ancient Great Hall where centuries of important decisions had been made. "We'll need to update our social media policies," the manager noted, "but we should also recognize this as an opportunity to educate visitors about why these traditions matter." Plans were already being made to create informational displays about the Guard's role and history, incorporating both traditional exhibits and modern digital elements to engage younger visitors. As the excitement gradually subsided, Callum maintained his post with unwavering dignity. The colonel's earlier words echoed through the square. Some traditions deserve respect not because they're entertaining, but because they're sacred. The guard duty would continue as it had for centuries, but now with a renewed public understanding of its significance. Visitors passed by with newfound appreciation, their photos taken not as social media fodder, but as respectful documentation of a living tradition. The incident would be discussed in Edinburgh pubs and coffee shops for weeks to come, spawning countless conversations about the role of tradition in the modern world. But its immediate impact was clear in the respectful hush that had settled over Crown Square. Visitors now paused to read the historical plaques they might have previously ignored, and smartphones were lifted more thoughtfully, with a new awareness of the line between documentation and disrespect. The ancient stones of Edinburgh Castle had witnessed countless moments of triumph and defeat throughout their long history. Today, they had seen something uniquely modern, a victory not of arms or armies, but of dignity over disrespect, of tradition over transient fame. As the autumn sun climbed higher over the castle ramparts, it illuminated a scene that spoke to both past and present. Sacred duties honored, ancient traditions preserved, and timeless values reinforced in a digital age. The castle stood proud against the Edinburgh skyline, its role as guardian of Scottish tradition stronger than ever in these changing times. All his carefully constructed online influence counted for nothing against the raw authenticity of genuine tradition and respect. 1 week after the incident, Edinburgh Castle hummed with a different kind of energy. Visitor numbers had actually increased, drawn by the viral story but staying for something deeper. The morning sun cast long shadows across Crown Square, where Callum McPherson once again stood his post, though things had subtly changed in ways that went beyond the physical. The castle administration had installed a new, dignified plaque near the guard post, explaining the history and significance of the Royal Regiment of Scotland. "In honor of all who serve," it read, "past, present, and future." Colonel MacLeod had helped write the text, ensuring it captured both the tradition's history and its living relevance. Tour guides reported that it had become one of the most photographed spots in the castle, not for social media pranks, but for genuine appreciation. Bradley's viral moment had indeed achieved record-breaking views, though not as he'd intended. The clip of his confrontation with the colonel had become a teaching moment, shared in corporate seminars about cultural sensitivity and military history classes alike. His tech company's board had placed him on indefinite leave, and he'd issued a formal apology that actually seemed sincere. The experience had humbled him in ways his Silicon Valley success never had. Lisa, surprisingly, had transformed her influencer brand entirely. She now specialized in cultural heritage tourism, working with historical sites to promote respectful engagement. Her first documentary project, Guardians of Tradition, featured interviews with military guards from historic sites around the world. The colonel had agreed to serve as a consulting producer, lending his expertise to ensure accuracy and respect. The incident had sparked something of a movement in Edinburgh's tourism industry. Local tour companies now included special sections about military traditions in their guided walks. Gift shops along the Royal Mile displayed books about Scottish military history prominently, and several pubs had created special areas dedicated to regimental memorabilia. Even street performers had incorporated more respectful nods to military tradition into their acts. More significantly, the castle had become a focal point for discussions about how traditional institutions could maintain their dignity in the social media age. Educational programs were developed, bringing school groups to meet with retired guards and learn about the deeper meaning behind the ceremonies. The colonel's impromptu defense of tradition had evolved into a regular series of talks, drawing visitors from around the world. Callum himself had received hundreds of letters of support, though he maintained his professional distance and dignity. His commanding officer had noted that recruitment inquiries for the regiment had increased significantly, particularly from young people who cited the viral incident as their inspiration. The regiment's motto, Nemo me impune licessit, had taken on new meaning in the digital age. The castle's own social media presence had evolved thoughtfully. Instead of chasing viral moments, they shared daily posts about history, tradition, and the people who maintained them. Their most popular feature became the Guardians Perspective series, showing the castle and its traditions through the eyes of those who served there. It garnered millions of respectful follows, proving that tradition and modern media could coexist with dignity. International media continued to reference the incident in discussions about social media culture and traditional values. Documentarians had approached the castle about producing a feature on the changing role of ceremonial guards in the modern world. The colonel's words about battles fought with dignity had been quoted in academic papers and popular articles alike. Most meaningfully, other historic sites around the world had begun implementing what they called the Edinburgh Protocol, guidelines for maintaining tradition while managing modern social media challenges. The incident had sparked a global conversation about respect, tradition, and the balance between preservation and accessibility. On this particular morning, as Callum stood his post, a young American tourist approached with her daughter. Instead of pulling out a phone for photos, she pointed to the new plaque. "Read that," she told her child. "This is what real strength looks like." The girl nodded solemnly, understanding something profound about respect that no social media post could convey. The colonel, who now regularly visited the castle to share its history with interested visitors, watched this interaction with quiet satisfaction. The clash between tradition and social media hunger had led not to defeat for either side, but to a deeper understanding of how both could coexist with proper respect. As the morning mist cleared from Edinburgh's ancient stones, the castle stood as it had for centuries, a guardian of history and tradition. But now it also stood as something more, a symbol of how timeless values could triumph in the digital age, not through force or confrontation, but through the quiet strength of unwavering dignity. The ravens circled overhead, their calls echoing off the ancient walls, as if nature itself was still applauding the victory of tradition over temporary fame. In the end, the viral moment that Bradley had sought had indeed come to pass, but it had served a far greater purpose than mere entertainment. It had reminded the world that some things, duty, honor, tradition, transcend the fleeting fame of social media, standing as firm as the castle itself against the winds of change. All his carefully constructed online influence counted for nothing against the raw authenticity of genuine tradition and respect. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.